Hi, this is John Collin. Welcome to a special edition of Heroes of the Pandemic. In this episode, I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Dr. Stephen Quay. It was Dr. Stephen Quay's testimony in front of Congress that really opened the Overton window regarding the discussion about whether the virus came from a wet market or came from a laboratory. I'm going to play this clip from Congress of Dr. Quay, but he's going to join me for a discussion for about 90 minutes. We're going to talk about the outbreaks, his research, his paper, and he has 91 patents in 22 different fields of medicine, imaging, MRI, cancer research, etc. He's the CEO and founder of Atossa Therapeutics. It's a great honor to have on the show Dr. Stephen Quay. Let me play this clip from Congress, and then Dr. Quay will join us.
He's a physician and a scientist with hundreds of published scientific articles. Dr. Quay has been cited over 10,000 times, holds 87 patents across 22 different fields of medicine, and he's invented 7 different FDA-approved medicines. Further, he conducted an early analysis of COVID-19, which has been downloaded nearly 200,000 times. He's an expert in the field and brings an upper echelon of analysis to the question we're posing today about the origins. Now to you, Dr. Quay.
Thank you, Congressman Scalise and Comer, members of the subcommittee of the coronavirus crisis, ladies and gentlemen. As inconvenient as it is, I believe the evidence conclusively establishes that the COVID pandemic was not a natural process, but instead came from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, and that it has the fingerprints of genetic manipulation through a process called gain-of-function research. There are 6 undisputed facts that support this hypothesis. Now, as a reminder, the top left there, a little science. As a reminder, all zoonoses are diseases that involve a virus infecting an animal, the animal coming in contact with a human, and then the human being infected. The question of the origin of a zoonosis is the question of the location of the animal. In natural zoonoses, the animal is in nature, a cave, a farm, or the market. The infected human comes in contact with the animal and gets sick. For lab-acquired zoonoses, the animal is in a laboratory or in cells from an animal in a petri dish, and the human works in that lab. In deciding between a natural origin and the lab origin, there are 6 facts no one disagrees with. Number 1, the Chinese first told the world that the COVID pandemic began in the Hunan seafood market because approximately 1/2 of the early cases had been associated with that location. This would have been reminiscent of the 2 previous coronavirus epidemics, as both SARS-1 and MERS began in live animal markets. However, after 18 months of investigation, we now know it did not begin in a market in Wuhan for the following 3 reasons. First, none of the 11 patients from the Hunan market or any other market in Wuhan were infected with the earliest virus, meaning they came into the market already infected. The 4 patients with the earliest genetic version of the virus all had one thing in common. None had any exposure to the Hunan market. Second, we know in January 2020 from public scientific databases that the patient with the earliest first complete virus sequence was a 39-year-old man treated at the General Hospital of Central Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army of China, located on Wuhou Road in the Wuchang district of Wuhan, about 3 kilometers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. After 18 months and almost 3 million viruses sequenced worldwide, this virus still remains the earliest. Second, none of the environmental specimens from the market had the earliest virus, meaning they also came into the market. This included 1,055 samples of frozen food in the market, all of which tested negative for COVID. Third, 457 animals from Hunan market were tested. All were negative for COVID. 616 animals from suppliers to the market were tested. All were negative. 1,864 wild animals from southern China of the type found in the market were tested. They were also all negative. These data from the publicly available WHO report established that it did not begin in the Hunan market or any other market in Wuhan. Number two, failing to find it in any market in Wuhan, the search was expanded to all of China. But after testing 80,000 samples from 209 different species from other markets, farms, and nature, the virus has not been found in a single specimen. The probability.
All right, so this reminds me of looking for MH370 west of Australia in the southern Indian Ocean. It's like they're looking at all these animals, and they're testing seafood, and they're testing this, and they're looking for the coronavirus, and did it come from the fish, or did it come from the turtle? What the hell difference does it make? People are dying from influenza. If people were dying from reconstructed pandemic influenza, what difference does it make where the SARS-CoV-2 came from? So again, we get back to the heart of the matter from my perspective, which is if there aren't 10 people dead in Beijing and there aren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, and there still aren't 100 dead in Vietnam, how deadly is SARS-CoV-2 in and of itself? I'm not talking about all the comorbidity stuff. I understand that. But SARS-CoV-2 itself, just on the death certificates, SARS-CoV-2 itself alone accounts for 5% of the roughly 600,000 deaths. Just 5%. That's less than 30,000 people right now in the United States that have died with just SARS-CoV-2. And if there aren't 10 in Beijing, and there aren't 10 in Shanghai, and there's not 100 in Vietnam, why are they obsessing about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and not the influenza that everybody appears to have stopped reporting on?
The probability of this for a community-acquired infection is about 1 in a million. This is what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. Number three, after testing 9,952 stored human blood specimens from hospitals in Wuhan from before December 29th, there was not a single case of COVID in any specimen. It was expected that between 100 and 400 would be positive. The probability of this for a community-acquired infection is also about 1 in a million. But this is what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. There is no evidence of multiple animal-to-human transmissions. With 2 prior coronavirus outbreaks, SARS-1 and MERS, 50 to 90% of early cases were from various animal-to-human infections. For SARS-CoV-2, 249 early cases of COVID-19 were examined genetically, and they all were human-to-human transmission. For a community-acquired infection, this is the probability of tossing a coin 249 times and getting heads every single time. This is, however, what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. Number 5, SARS-CoV-2 has a unique trigger on its surface called a furin cleavage site and a unique code in the genes for that site called a CGG dimer.
Ta-da! Now, I know Dan Bongino was talking about this, so tip of the hat to Dan. He brought this up, the CGG. So, this is, again, there's a lot of information here. This is a multi-hour testimony, and this is kind of key. So, again, tip of the hat to Dan for finding this, or whoever pointed it out to Dan Bongino. Let's listen again to what this doctor says about the CGG, because it's a very specific part.
249 times and getting heads every single time. This is, however, what you'd expect for a lab-acquired infection. Number 5, SARS-CoV-2 has a unique trigger on its surface called a furin cleavage site and a unique code in the genes for that site called a CGG-CGG dimer. So these are two independent levels of uniqueness. The furin site is why the virus is so transmissible, why it invades the heart, the brain, and the blood vessels. Viruses like Ebola, HIV, Zika, yellow fever all use furin sites, and this is part of the reason for their deadliness. But the entire group of coronaviruses in which SARS-CoV-2 belongs does not contain a single example of a furin site or a single example of the CGG-CGG dimer code.
Huh. So isn't that interesting? So what he's saying is none of the other coronaviruses have this. But Ebola does. Did you hear that? Okay, let's go back. Ebola has it. Remember I told you Dr. Chu and her Ebola research was going to play a role. Here we go.
Transmissible, why it invades the heart, the brain, and the blood vessels. Viruses like Ebola, HIV, Zika, yellow fever all use furin sites, and this is part of the reason for their deadliness.
Furin sites. Furin sites. So Ebola uses furin sites. No other coronavirus has furin sites other than SARS-CoV-2. Huh. That's according to this guy, not according to me. I don't give advice. I don't make any claims. I'm just sharing my understanding of what he just said. Okay, and he's like a big shot testifying to Congress. So testing my understanding, he said Ebola has these things. No other coronavirus has them other than SARS-CoV-2.
But the entire group of coronaviruses in which SARS-CoV-2 belongs does not contain a single example of a furin site or a single example of the CGG-CGG dimer code. A comprehensive...
All right, so the CGG-CGG dimer code related to the furin sites. Okay, we're a little bit out of my world here, but it makes sense, right? So he's describing it. He's saying it exists in Ebola, HIV, these other deadly diseases, Zika virus, doesn't exist in any other coronavirus other than this one. That's my understanding. I could be wrong.
By MIT group shows that there has never been a furin site or the CGG letter dimer in this group of coronaviruses for at least 1,000 years, since William won the Battle of Hastings in 1066 to become monarch of England. But since 1992, in gain-of-function experiments, the WIV and other laboratories around the world have inserted furin sites into viruses repeatedly. It is the only sure method that always works and always makes them more infectious. And the CGG-CGG code found in COVID-19 is commonly used in laboratories around the world, including the WIV. You can literally order it from a supply company on the internet. By the way, some virologists have said, well, but Dr. Quay, furin sites and codon dimers occur in one or more other of the 4 classes of coronaviruses, and with a process called recombination, a COVID-like virus could pick one up. This is wrong for 3 reasons based on well-known fundamental biology, probably college level. Because coronaviruses do exchange genetic material so easily, the very existence and stability of these 5 distinct groups is evidence from nature that there must be barriers for exchange of genetic material. I've spoken previously about the 1,000-year stability of the group of COVID that COVID belongs to. If recombination was easy, this group would have merged into the other 4 into a single group. 2 things stop recombination from happening. And this includes research by Dr. Daszak and Shi, by the way. First, recombination happens when one poor bat is infected with 2 different viruses, and during that co-infection, the genetic material gets exchanged. So,
One poor bat is infected by 2 viruses at the same time. And it sounds like those 2 viruses create a some sort of a hybrid virus. Is that my understanding here? Let's hear this again.
During that co-infection, the genetic material gets exchanged. So here, the group of viruses that have furin sites and CGG dimers don't infect the same bat species as the COVID-like viruses that don't have furin sites. So the COVID viruses can only exchange genetic
To be honest, he just lost me on that, and I'm not going to dig in. Let's just see where he goes. I think he's almost done. We're going to go to the next person.
material within their group, the group that hasn't had a furin site or a CGG dimer for 1,000 years. Now, second, even if you force two different viruses into a cell in the laboratory, there are unique genetic sequences that are required for gene combination or recombination to occur. The hotspots where exchange can occur are different for each group and incompatible between the groups. In a clever use of this concept, Dr. Ralph Baric, a leading coronavirus scientist from North Carolina, once made a vaccine candidate that was resistant to recombination. He didn't want to recombine after he put it out in the world. He did this by using synthetic biology to change the hotspot gene sequences.
So I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Stephen Quay. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor to have you here on Hypothetically Speaking.
Same here, John. It's great to be here.
It's a true honor. The audience, I just spent a moment with them walking through your testimony to Congress. A couple years ago, you and a couple other experts had the opportunity to testify in front of Congress. And that was sort of my first introduction to you and your work. Was you sitting in front of Congress. And, as we get to know you better over the course of the last couple of years, of course, CEO, founder of Atossa Pharmaceuticals, you've got numerous patents and medications that are on the market today. So that, there's people today who survived cancer because of your work and may not know that, right? There's people watching the show that may have survived cancer because of your work. And I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know that. This guy saved my life. So, tip of the hat to you, sir.
Well, thank you. I found my purpose in life, which was trying to help people through medicine and through the applications of healthcare and that sort of thing. And I retired once at 39. I was a single guy living in Monte Carlo for a year.
No way. Monte Carlo? Really?
Yeah, I'm not. That's a long story. I'm not as much of a hedonist as I thought I was. I went back to work, and I won't retire now. I just like it. I like too much.
I love to ask everybody, where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school in two places: Northville, Michigan, near Detroit, for the first 2 years, and then Sparta, Michigan, on the west side of the state. My dad was a high school chemistry physics teacher. He became principal at Sparta to make a little more money because teachers don't make a lot of money. We moved across the state. I recently, Northville was a town that was built in the late 1800s by Henry Ford for his workers in a valve plant. Every valve that went into a machine in World War II was made in the town I grew up in. And so I wrote a book called A Ride Through Northville, which is available from the Northville Historical Society, about the little town. We thought it was just the place you grew up, and now it's kind of a Victorian landmark in the state of Michigan. So
that's wild.
Yeah.
Well, you've had an illustrious career. Obviously, just the fact that you lived in Monaco, we need to do a whole show on that because Monte Carlo is wild. I had the opportunity to go there once, and that's a whole wild story. So we need to talk about that. But one of the, after you gave this testimony, I felt like the Overton window opened. It shifted. We saw Jon Stewart go on the Stephen Colbert show. I don't know if anybody remembers Stephen Colbert, but there was this guy named Stephen Colbert that used to have a TV show, and Jon Stewart went on the show, and I'll play the clip for the audience in a moment here, and basically introduces this notion that there's this Wuhan Institute of Virology, and there's a chocolate mess and there's a chocolate factory. It's like, guys, this isn't too hard to connect the dots. And it was almost
the name of the virus is on the building.
Exactly. And
I honestly mean this. I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to science. Science has, in many ways, helped ease the suffering of this pandemic, which was more than likely caused by science. So, and that's kind of.
Hold on a second.
No. Listen.
It's coffee. I wouldn't do that to you. I wouldn't do that to you.
I'm all for spit takes.
But what do you mean by that? Do you mean like there's a chance that this was created in a lab? There's an investigation.
A chance?
Well, but
oh my
if there was
God.
evidence, I'd love to hear it.
There's a novel respiratory coronavirus overtaking Wuhan, China. What do? Oh, you know who we could ask? The Wuhan Novel Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. The disease is the same name as the lab. That's just a little too weird, don't you think? And then they ask those scientists, they're like, how did this, so wait a minute, you work at the Wuhan Respiratory Coronavirus Lab. How did this happen? And they're like, a pangolin kissed a turtle. And you're like, no, the name of your lab. If you look at the name, let me see your business card. Show me your business card. Oh, I work at the coronavirus lab in Wuhan. Oh, because there's a coronavirus loose in Wuhan. How did that happen? Maybe a bat flew into the cloaca of a turkey and then it sneezed into my chili, and now we all have coronavirus. Like, come. Okay.
Wait a second.
What about this? Listen to this.
Wait a second.
All right,
John.
Oh my God. There's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness near Hershey, Pennsylvania. What do you think happened? Like, I don't know. Maybe a steam shovel mated with a cocoa bean, or it's the chocolate factory. Maybe that's it.
That could be. That could
By
be.
the way, I gave them all tuberculosis.
That could very well be, and Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins at NIH have said, it should definitely be investigated.
Don't stop with the logic and people and things. The name of the disease.
Wait a second.
The building.
Wait a second. But it could be possible. You could be right. It could be possible that they have the lab in Wuhan to study the novel coronavirus diseases because
and Wuhan, it was anathema to even introduce it. I mean, Stephen Colbert, you could see, he's like, what? Where's he going with this? You weren't allowed to talk about this coming from a laboratory. And when all this COVID stuff started, I don't know if you know this, I used to live in Thailand. I lived in Thailand for 6 plus years. Mm-hmm. And I used to shop in wet markets. So I was surprised we didn't have pandemics 3 times a year. I see eels and ducks and turtles and frogs all right next to each other. The guy's cutting up the pork over here and this one's cutting up the fish. Mm-hmm. I was amazed we didn't have these outbreaks. I was like, yeah, this makes perfect sense to me. Until you start doing the science. And this is where you came in and show up to Congress and you're like, I'll give you guys 5 reasons why there's no way this came from a wet market. This absolutely had to have come from a lab. And when you started to explain it in terms that people could understand, even using the term dimer, right, which nobody knows what you're talking about when you say dimer, nobody knows what that is. But people listening were like, all right, this is a pretty concrete argument here. You know, these 5 reasons are kind of building on each other to the extent that, tell us what that was like for you to be the guy to sit in front of Congress and tell people, guys, this is not a wet market thing. You're being sold a bill of goods. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure, I can. So, I mean, look, as we've said a little bit, alluded to, you know, I mean, I grew up in Michigan, went to University of Michigan, MD, PhD, trained in Boston, taught at Stanford, but you know, I was a private citizen. I was a biotech executive and living my life and that sort of thing. And so when you get a call from Senator Paul and, you know, to come and testify in the Senate, and then I was also testifying in the House a few times, huge honor. And I felt, you know, obliged as an American citizen just to do my part. So there was that aspect of it going into it. And, you know, the gravitas of being in the Senate building and seeing imagining the hearings that have been held there over hundreds of years, or 150 years, I guess, et cetera. So there was that aspect of it clearly. And then there was the testimony itself, which I had tried to frame because you're given a limited amount of time. So I have a written document that's much longer than my oral testimony. But you want to imagine that in 5 to 8 minutes, you're going to take someone who perhaps knows nothing about this other than what they read in the New York Times or CNN, and can kind of say, hey, wait a minute, I need to think more about this. So that was my goal, was to mainly get people to think more about it, not necessarily to make a decision based on my evidence. But nonetheless, I think it actually, I may have achieved more than just laying out new evidence. I think it does point pretty hardly towards a laboratory origin.
Oh, no question. I mean, there's no doubt. But were you filled with, to a certain degree, a sense of, this might take a toll on me because what I'm about to share is not going to be popular? I mean, this has not been the narrative. What you were bringing forward was counter to the narrative. I mean, what kind of thoughts were you having about that? I mean, I know I've had my own experience with this in the things that I've researched. Were you concerned that this would take a toll on Atossa? Were you know, what were your thoughts on that?
Well, John, I think the phrase I would use it for my thoughts on that was déjà vu.
Okay.
Because when I was a resident at the Mass General, the Harvard Teaching Hospital in Boston, you know, unfortunately, my advisor, so I was doing medicine and, you know, taking care of patients and that sort of thing. But I also was doing research on the side because I can't stop doing research. And my scientific advisor, who was doing work on Hodgkin's disease, it turned out had faked his data. And I had to go in front of the chairman. And so I got the chairman there. I'm a resident. I got this, you know, soon to be tenured professor sitting next to me saying I'm lying. And the chairman saying, Quay, you're going to have to prove this or you're going to be fired. He didn't add that, but, you know. And Nicholas Wade and Bill Broad wrote a book about that included that called Betrayers of the Truth.
Wow.
So I had the experience of having been, you know, having to be a whistleblower. And frankly, seeing the impact it had on my own career in academics. And I don't want to go into too many of the details on it, but it was a negative impact, just to put it like that. And I ended up, you know, at Stanford for 10 years and was very happy there and was grateful that I moved to the West Coast. But, you know, I've talked to other people who've been involved with this who were earlier in the career, you know, Dr. You know, Lena Chan, who's at Broad Institute and, you know, kind of where I was in that space and saying, you need to understand that it may not be overt, but this will have an impact on your trajectory and in life from an academic point of view.
No doubt.
On the other hand, it's still the right thing to do because the first person you see in the morning is yourself in the mirror, and
Indeed.
you need to be able to look at yourself straight, square, and honestly.
Yeah, but what you did took a tremendous amount of courage. And again, to me, it was your testimony. It was you coming forward with your credentials and explaining it in a manner that people could understand. That was the watershed moment. I mean, it changed the Overton window. People started to say, all right, so maybe it did come from the lab. If it did, hypothetically, was it a leak? Was it intentional, et cetera, et cetera? But you weren't even allowed to talk about that 60 days before your testimony. You couldn't even bring that up, or that, you'd get canceled. They'd shut off your account or whatever, whether it was Facebook or Twitter, whatever back then. You weren't allowed to suggest that. But you've done it before. You've felt the social stigma that comes along with stepping out of line and blowing the whistle, as have I. I anticipated it. I kind of knew this was going to happen when I did my research on the Las Vegas shooting. I expected this type of behavior. But then something happened during COVID that I didn't really discover until about a year and a half ago, which was your research working with Mona and Dayu into early stage clinical activity in Wuhan. And it turns out that you wrote the paper with Mona, right? So, and I'm forgive me if I'm butchering Mona's name, but I know she has an Indian name, and I'll get that wrong. Can you tell everybody about that, a little bit about that paper that you worked on with Mona and with Dayu?
Sure, absolutely. No, so it's a very interesting paper. So,
I'll say,
sorry,
it's the premise. It's the premise for all of my findings. So yes, it's a big deal. Yeah. It's a big deal.
So let's get into the weeds a little bit, as they say.
Please.
And you can do that in a podcast.
Yes.
So the starting point, the anchor for this work was a publication from Zhenji Shi at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and her colleagues that first sort of characterized this virus, where it came from, bats, RATG13, and all these sorts of things, in a paper that was published as a preprint on January 21st, I believe, of 2020, finally published as a peer-reviewed paper on February 4th in Nature, which was the foundation. And so there were 7 patients that were described in that.
Right.
6 of them had PCR evidence of SARS-CoV-2 in their blood, and then they were characterized of the clinical outcomes and that sort of thing. When you do these kinds of, when a sample is taken from a patient and run through NGS sequencing methods, basically you chop the genetic code up into about 200 nucleotide pieces. You amplify it like crazy, and you might end up with 200 million 200-letter sequences of genetic code. And then you look for things inside that. And so she had assembled the SARS-CoV-2 virus out of these samples, and that's what her publication was about. But you can look for other things in there as well.
Right. But this is something we don't do, though. So hang on. Let's just slow down a little bit for the audience, just because you go pretty quick with this stuff. You were talking about a certain type of testing, and I'm familiar because we looked at the paper, but I don't understand it that well. But I understand it well enough to know that there's something called metagenomic testing. And the metagenomic test, is that what you're describing here, where you amplify everything? Is that metagenomic, or is that something different?
That's something different. If I could just leave it at that. So
okay.
Again, so the way the protocol works is it takes all the genetic material in a human sample. These were taken from the throat of these 7 patients in the ICU in a hospital in Wuhan. And it amplifies all the genetic material that's in there. Human cells, bacteria, viruses, mitochondria, anything that's in there. And it turns out that a common, we'll call it a problem, but in this case it's a feature of this method, is it also amplifies any leftover nucleic acid sequences from the laboratory, from the reagent bottles, from the air, from the machines themselves. Because it's so sensitive in amplifying anything that's there.
So you're picking up yeast and stuff that's in the air,
you
literally.
pick up anything that's going on. And
right,
John,
right.
so one of the things that we did as a foundation for what we found was to say, okay, we found 20 things that shouldn't have been in a patient. So, all kinds of viruses that shouldn't be there, animal viruses, insect genes, and these sorts of things.
Nice.
And then for 19 out of 20 of those, we found research going on in the Wuhan laboratory that mapped to those sequences.
Ooh.
So when we found insect DNA in the human samples, we found a paper published in the last 2 years in that laboratory saying, hey, we used insect genes to amplify proteins.
No,
Bingo. Exactly.
Okay.
So the Nipah virus was the one we didn't find, but among those was influenza sequences, where there was absolutely clear evidence that the influenza antigen for making vaccines was present with promoters and all of the attachments that were involved with creating an influenza vaccine.
Right.
And we published that, and because these patients shouldn't, there was no evidence they had ever had an influenza vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. So this method, which is now probably been standardized, is a way of doing a forensic analysis of a laboratory, from your armchair 5,000 miles away.
Right.
Again, by looking at the consequences of the next generation sequence and NGS process itself.
Okay, so this is next generation sequencing.
Yes.
This is different. Yes. All right, so one of the things that was in the paper was that red donut-looking chart that showed 8% and 2%, and it showed bamboo mosaic virus. It showed a number of herpes simplex viruses, right? Everything was in there, but if the levels were like 0.008, 0.006, until we got to SARS-CoV-2, which was in the 2 percentile. The H7N9 was in the 8 percentile in one of the patients. Now, was that the NGS, or was that metagenomic, or was that next generation? Which is that shows all those different things? Which is that?
Well, those are typically called Krona, Krona charts, and they're an algorithm that GeneBank does automatically, and they create a pie chart of what's in a sample, and you have this dark matter, as they call it, which is things that can't be identified, and then it's split up according to that. But I think the way to describe it, John, is that what we've talked about now, when I said there are 20 things in the patients that shouldn't have been there, I'm talking just qualitatively. I'm not saying how much. The Krona analysis goes to the next point is, well, how much of each of these 20 things is there? Because as you're maybe about to point out, or I don't want to steal your thunder, but one of the patients had more influenza sequences than they had SARS-CoV-2 sequences. That really gets into the question of, the title of the paper itself was this vaccine research, or was it just contamination in the laboratory? It's pretty hard to imagine that simple contamination in the laboratory would lead to a finding of so much influenza vaccine. I think a clear hypothesis would be that maybe that patient was given an influenza vaccine that was contaminated with SARS-CoV-2, which I don't think we state explicitly in the paper, but that's certainly a hanging hypothesis that any smart patient could make. Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so let's talk about that for a second. So if you're willing to accept, and the audience is willing to accept, that SARS-CoV-2 was developed at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I've explained it to people as it has too many bells and whistles. It's almost like the fishing lures that you go to Cabela's or Bass Pro, and they have the hologram, and they have the little beads inside, and they got the, all kinds of stuff. And I felt like SARS-CoV-2 with the furin cleavage site and the GP120 sequence that the guys in India had to retract the paper. I'm like, wait a sec. This has got too many bells. This is like a Christmas tree. it's like they're trying to get people's attention with this thing. And it caused me to kind of look at it a little bit sideways. And the fact that it was being promoted, meaning the virus, SARS-CoV-2, COVID, was being promoted so heavily, so early, also made me kind of look at it askance a bit and say, what's going on here? Why are they selling this so hard? And so your work allows us to say, all right, SARS-CoV-2 may have been, well, I think the likelihood is but beyond 99.9%, engineered. It's an engineered virus, came from Wuhan. I think it was released intentionally. And we know that the Chinese were vaccinating the population against H7N9. They developed a vaccine. One of the things that kind of blew my mind was that they put H5N1 and H7N9 in the same vaccine. Which I mean, I'm not in your world, but if you were designing a vaccine, I mean, isn't that begging for recombination? Putting H5N1 and H7N9 in the same vaccine and sticking it in people? I mean, aren't you begging for some recombination to happen there, or am I just being?
Well, it depends. So in the case, in what we found in the laboratory with respect to influenza, there was not a complete infectious virus at all.
Right.
So it's missing almost 2/3.
So it's antigen pieces
of the genes necessary. It's just the hemagglutinin antigen. So if you combine the two of those in the same vaccine, it kind of might be a good idea in the sense that if your immune system can handle, which I think it can, you'll make antibodies to both of them, and then you sort of get double protection.
Two different spikes, though. Two completely different spike proteins. The H5 protein, the H7 protein, different.
They're antigenically different. Yes, I mean they're in the same family, but they're definitely relatives, but they're definitely quite different. In that sense, you're absolutely right.
All right, so we know that the Chinese were vaccinating their people, and that turns into sort of this clue. So I look at this paper that you author, right, and I start looking at this and say, wait a second, H7N9 in China. Why were people getting vaccinated for H7N9 in China? And I stumble across this video, or somebody shared it with me, from CNN, talking about this unbelievable outbreak of influenza in Wuhan predating COVID.
Startlingly, these documents reveal there was an enormous spike in influenza cases in Hubei, right when studies have shown the very first known patients were infected with COVID-19. 20 times the number of flu cases compared to the same week the year before. Experts said it could have flooded the hospital system with patients sick from flu-like symptoms. But they show flu patients were regularly screened, and many did not have a known flu virus strain. The documents also show the flu outbreak was biggest that first week in December, not in Wuhan, but in 2 other cities nearby in Hubei. All valuable information in the hunt for where the disease came from.
I had a chance to sit down with Dr. Bob Malone. I think you know Bob, right? You know Bob Malone.
I do.
So I had a chance to sit down with Bob, and I walked through this with him. And he was sharing with us that, and he talked about this when he was on the Joe Rogan show, that a guy named Michael Callahan, whose business card says DARPA and the other side says Harvard, but he really works for the CIA, called Bob and said, hey, I need you to get your team together. We got this outbreak going on here in Wuhan, and it is not good. But when he called, it was January 4th.
There's a CIA agent that I've co-published with in the past named Michael Callahan. He was in Wuhan in the fourth quarter of 2019. He called me from Wuhan on January 4th, and he told me, Robert, you got to get your team spun up because we got a problem with this new virus. I worked with him through prior outbreaks.
The virus hadn't been identified yet, meaning SARS-CoV-2. And the outbreak that CNN is reporting on has got a 2,100% increase in cases year over year.
Startlingly, these documents reveal there was an enormous spike in influenza cases in Hubei, right when studies have shown the very first known patients were infected with COVID-19. 20 times the number of flu cases compared to the same week the year before. Experts said it could have flooded the hospital system with patients sick from flu-like symptoms. But they show flu patients were regularly screened, and many did not have a known flu virus strain. The documents also show the flu outbreak was biggest that first week in December, not in Wuhan, but in 2 other cities nearby in Hubei. All valuable information in the hunt for where the disease came from.
And I'm saying to myself, whoa. You're telling me there's this massive outbreak of influenza in Wuhan and the other big cities in Hubei. And we've been tracking this H7N9 for years now. And the Pentagon's been tracking it. And Kawaoka did gain of function on it in 2014. Is it too many coincidences lining up here? This is starting to look to me as if, and this is, I know it sounds crazy, it looks to me like Kawaoka did gain of function 3 weeks after the pause. That's not a theory. We know that, right? So the letter, right? You've seen this letter, the letter to Jenny Dahlberg from Fauci. It's from the National Institute of Health, NIAID, whatever, National Institute of Allergy Diseases, giving Kawaoka the green light to go ahead with gain of function in 2014. I posit this is why Fauci's pardon goes back to 2014. They did gain of function 3 weeks after the pause.
Okay. I mean, that's, I guess, your claim. But,
that's what the letter says.
I won't disagree with it.
Right. It's in the letter. It says, you're grandfathered in because it was already budgeted and whatever, and it was already approved, and it's 3 weeks after, right? So we have that letter. But the other thing that it says, the first little bullet there, it says that we want you to investigate, is it possible to give influenza Ebola-like pathogenicity? It's like, can you teach my pit bull how to kill like a Kodiak bear? I thought, why would you want to?
I haven't seen that letter, John.
All right. I'll email it to you as soon as we wrap this up. I'll email it to you. So it's a letter from NIAID, from Fauci's organization, to Jenny Dahlberg at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's basically telling Kawaoka, we need you to do gain of function on H7N9, and you don't have to worry about the pause. And we want you to see if there's a way to add like Ebola-like pathogenicity. It's a bullet. You'll say, I'll put it up on the screen here for the audience, and I'll email it to you. So I'm looking at this, and the Pentagon starts monitoring H7N9 in China in 2014, the same year we're doing this gain of function. And I'm thinking, why is the Pentagon monitoring a respiratory infection in China?
Yeah, I don't know anything about that, but
all right. So again, I'll share that with you as well. So I'll email both of those to you, and I'll send them to Susie. So the idea here is there's a backstory here of H7N9, gain of function, Pentagon involvement, and next thing you know, the Nat Geo publishes a story about Michael Callahan going to Hubei to collaborate with the Chinese on a bird flu outbreak. Well,
I'm familiar with that.
All right. So since when do we send the CIA to collaborate? That's not really what they do, right? And the people there don't know he's with the CIA. We only know he's with the CIA because Bob Malone told us that on the Joe Rogan show. His business card says DARPA, Harvard Medical School. That's what it says on the business card. Bob told us he's with the CIA. And he's over in China working on a bird flu outbreak. Well, lo and behold, 2,100% increase in cases year over year. And what happens in January 2019? Trump starts Operation Crimson Contagion. What is that? It's an exercise that goes from January to August of 2019. And it's a exercise about an H7N9 outbreak in China. But the World Health Organization told us in 2013 there is one. And we've documented the 5 waves, right? The Chinese documented wave after wave after wave, and it kept getting more pathogenic.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2019, it hits a 40% case fatality rate. There's only 1,600 people, but 40%?
I'm not familiar with that at all. I was
my gosh.
with one case in China of influenza, a fatal influenza in the spring.
No. They started tracking it. So the WHO was on it in 2013, and the UNFAO, so the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, was tracking it because it was impacting the poultry. It ends up wiping out 25% of the poultry industry in China.
Mm-hmm.
The bird flu outbreak. And at the same time, by the way, you know about the Hungpu River incident with the pigs. African swine fever wiped out half the pigs in China. But this all happened at the same time.
2017, 2018, I think.
Yeah, this is all coincidence. So they're having a bird flu outbreak of H7N9, well documented by the UNFAO and the WHO. And they have an African swine fever outbreak devastating the pork industry. Wipes out half their pork. 500 million pigs. 25% of the chickens, 25% of the egg-laying chickens are wiped out. And we end up having the deadliest bird flu outbreak in human history in 2021, 2022. South Africa, Japan, Netherlands, Poland, Brazil, Chile is the deadliest bird flu outbreak in history. Wipes out a quarter of the egg-laying birds on Earth. But it's all happening coincident with COVID. I'm afraid we may have deployed H7N9 in order to devastate the food supply in China. But until you see these documents I'm talking about, it's too big a leap of faith. You need to see these pieces on the table in front of you. You need to see these documents. I'm going to ask Susie to print them out for you. But when you see the letter authorizing the gain of function in 2014, correlating with Fauci's pardon, when you see the UNFAO alerting to the H7N9 outbreak in 2013, and then the research documenting the waves and how each wave of it kept getting more pathogenic, why is the Pentagon monitoring a respiratory infection? They monitor.
But John, the chain of custody for that virus there's no chain of custody evidence going from the Wisconsin laboratories into China, right? There's no evidence that they ever shipped viruses to other laboratories.
No. But we know that we have the technique now from who's our friend out in San Diego who worked on the Human Genome Project. He can teleport viruses. You know who I'm talking about. He's a buddy of yours. He's out in San Diego at Scripps.
A major new outbreak started to take place in China. It was the H7N9 variant of flu. Some forward-looking Chinese scientists actually sequenced the isolate and posted the sequence on the internet. My team downloaded the sequence, so this is the first incidence of actually teleportation, and we remade the virus in my laboratory in La Jolla. And we were the only source that the CDC and pharmaceutical companies actually had of this new strain of flu virus because we made it. We made it in 24 hours.
Please tell me you have no contact with Wuhan.
No, and that's another story. The NIH should have never funded gain of function research.
No, not Ralph. Ralph is innocent, by the way. Ralph got a bad rap on this. Somehow, somebody doesn't like Ralph. Ralph had nothing to do with this. Kawaoka is our huckleberry. He's the problem child, not Ralph. This wasn't Ralph's doing. Ralph may have worked on SARS-CoV-2, but I don't think SARS-CoV-2 is the deadly virus. H7N9 doesn't need an ACE2 receptor. You know this. It doesn't need an ACE2 receptor, right? It's got this PKKR type thing. It's not like the furin cleavage site that does its magic when it arrives at an ACE2 receptor. This thing doesn't need furin. It doesn't need trypsin.
Well, that's right. Although to be clear, the SARS-CoV-2 furin site is cleaved on the exodus, so it's pre-cleaved once as the viruses are exiting from a cell, not on the entry side.
Interesting. I think everybody in the animation I've seen describes it as the furin cleavage site makes the entry possible, and you're saying no, it's actually the exit of the virus. It's when it's egressing from the cell.
Well, yeah. I mean, Dayu was the first to show that, and then we published on it more carefully. But yes, it's cleaved on the way out.
Wow. Okay, that's very interesting.
And that's why the D614G mutation, which stabilizes a split spike, happens so quickly. Because it's very unstable. It loses the receptor binding domain about 90% of the virus particles.
So then it has to do the work so it has to re-drill a hole basically. So it has to do it all over again.
It has to get its eye back. The receptor binding domain is the virus's eye for finding the ACE2.
Gotcha.
And that falls off once it's split on the way out.
Wow.
Well, yeah. So I mean, so your hypothesis is that all of this was influenza and not SARS-CoV-2.
Well, that SARS-CoV-2 is real. It's a real virus.
Okay.
You can find it, right? We can test for it. People have it. But it has a case fatality rate of 1%.
Or less.
Right.
Yes.
It's
very age dependent. Very age dependent.
Right. So if it has a case fatality rate of 1%, absolutely it's a real virus. I don't want to get it. Right? But this other virus has a case fatality rate of 30 to 40%. And what we saw in New York and New Jersey in the early time frame, so leading up to June 2020, when New York was really getting hit hard, they had a 31% case fatality rate.
Well, but have you drilled down on that as to what their age was or their comorbidities or whether they were overinflating on the ventilators? Because in retrospect, which you should never use, we made mistakes in that area.
I get it, but just taking it at arm's length. So in other words, just looking at New York and saying, why are so many people dying in New York compared to Nigeria, compared to Moscow, right? Compared to Mongolia, compared to Vietnam. There was nobody dead in Vietnam. So why are so many people dying in New York? And there's not 10 dead in Shanghai? There's not 10 dead in Hong Kong. Nobody's dead in Vietnam.
So what is your explanation for that? Because mine would be,
age
if
7
you
and 9.
looked at the ages or comorbidities, you could answer that.
Well, the explanation...
Nigeria is a very young population.
Well, no. I think Nigeria was actually measuring for SARS-CoV-2. And I think Christian Anderson helped kind of hide. I think at the end of the day, the reason the CIA wanted to meet with Dr. Fauci was because they were chartered with hiding the worst bird flu outbreak in human history. That's what they were asked to do. And so So there's that letter that we have, right? So Brad Wenstrup had this letter to the Inspector General at the CIA saying, why was Dr. Fauci meeting with the CIA and wasn't logged in? And then he quit. He resigned, right? He's not running for Congress. He's out. And we never got a response. Why did the CIA need to meet with Dr. Fauci? If Dr. Kawaoka's gain-of-function H7N9 was killing 30 to 40% of the people that were getting it, killing all these chickens, causing the worst bird flu outbreak in history, and it came from Wisconsin, we might want to cover that up and figure out a way to blame China.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of speculation.
Of course, of course.
One of the clinically distinctions of SARS-CoV-2 versus influenza is loss of taste or smell. And so I would be looking at clinical cases with that in point. One of your implications is if you don't test for influenza, they could have died of influenza. We didn't know it.
Right.
So I'm trying to back away from that and saying, well, clinically, anybody that lost their taste or smell, had SARS-CoV-2.
I would challenge
also
that.
had influenza, but not necessarily. Well, I've seen no data where the clinical presentation of influenza is loss of taste or smell. So, if you have that reference,
but that's because
please
this is a version of influenza that's never been seen in humans before, right? So if this is H7N9, we have no immunity to the H7 spike protein, and if it's a gain of function version that has Ebola-like pathogenicity, expecting a 30 to 40% case fatality rate, I mean, that's in the Ebola category. You're right there. You're BSL-4. So we know the H7N9 stuff, the work they've been doing now is BSL-4. The version that Kawaoka created, this highly pathogenic version, doesn't need trypsin, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and can infect anything. So, well, the first thing it's going to encounter is the nervous system in the sinus cavity, the tongue, the nose. And if it infects that, which it can, because it doesn't need any special receptor, it doesn't need trypsin. It goes wherever it wants to go, crosses blood-brain barrier, and research from Taubenberger suggests that these bird flu strains may be what causes encephalitis lethargica, sleeping sickness, whereas the other strains don't.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have a chain of command. There's a chain of custody on this. I just can't subscribe to it as you've currently.
Well, we know
presented.
there's an outbreak of H7N9. Like, that's well documented, right? Wave after wave after wave in China.
The data that I looked at, which was the fever clinics in Wuhan, gave weekly, presentation numbers, how many patients showed up, really did not have a spike in the fall. I was surprised by that. It didn't spike until January. So if there's an influenza outbreak in Wuhan that is calling people's attention, it didn't show up in the fever clinics. Maybe they went straight to the hospital. I'm not sure
the CNN report says they had a 2,100% increase in cases year over year as of the first week of December 2019.
These documents reveal there was an enormous spike in influenza cases in Hubei, right when studies have shown the very first known patients were infected with COVID-19. 20 times the number of flu cases compared to the same week the year before.
So 2,100% increase. I mean, that's a major number.
And what was CNN's source for that?
Documents that they got leaked from people in China, but were confirmed. I'll send you this story.
For some time now, in order to shift the blame, she said, some US politicians have constantly used the pandemic and other issues as a pretext to smear and demonize China and sow lies and misinformation about China. This will, of course, seriously mislead citizens of the United States and some other Western countries' understanding of the truth of China's fight against the epidemic. These documents, a rare, clear and open window into what China knew all along, trying to appear in control, while a local outbreak turned into a global pandemic.
A large outbreak of flu in Hubei. The documents also reveal a previously undisclosed 21-fold spike in influenza cases recorded in 1 week in early December in Hubei province. The spike, which occurred in the week beginning December 2nd, saw cases rise by approximately 2,059%. Now, what we saw on the screen in the video was 2,096%. I'm not sure why there's a discrepancy here. The screen showed us 2,096%. This is telling us 2,059%. Compared to the same week the year before, according to internal data. Notably, the outbreak that week is not felt most severely in Wuhan, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak, but in the nearby cities of Yichang with 6,135 cases and Jianing with 2,148 cases. Wuhan was the third worst hit with 2,032 new cases that week. I saw about 10,000 cases all told here. 6, 2, and 2. So about 10,000 cases in a week. Public data shows a nationwide spike of influenza in December. So they published the story, they did a video on it, and again, if that's true, if there's a 2,100% increase in influenza cases year over year in early December, and we know Kawaoka did the gain of function, and we know the UNFAO documented, and we know the Pentagon's monitoring it, it's not like it's a theory that there was an H7N9 outbreak in China. There was an H7N9 outbreak in China.
But you have no evidence that an engineered influenza strain made its way from Wisconsin to China.
So I may. So this is where I need to share something with you to analyze. And that's the, the next strain trees, right? You know, the trees that we do in next strain?
Of course.
All right. So there is a next strain tree of this virus that looks to me suspicious, but I'm a pedestrian, right? So I need you to look at this and say, wait a second. How did you guys end up here at the family picnic? You're not from Sweden. You know, you look like you're from Ethiopia. How did you end up here? It appears to me there's a branch on this family tree of H7N9 that looks remarkably suspicious, and I would love to share that with you and get your assessment of this, because to me, I think, if you and Dayu look at this, I think this may be the smoking gun that says, wait a second, this is not related to that. In other words, just like what you did with SARS-CoV-2, just like you said, I can't find an ancestor going back to June 2019, right? I can't, right? At some point I'm hitting a wall and there's no ancestors to this thing.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing, same concept here.
So I published a paper with Steve Massey here just recently, where we found 8 patients who from May of 2020 to January of 2021 had what are called frozen genomes, which is probably what you're describing, which is basically at the University of North Carolina Hospital, adjacent to Barrick's laboratory. And so the concept of a frozen genome is, if you look at what's going on in the community, there should be a new mutation every 2 weeks. So by June of 2020 or by January 2021, you're going to have 12, 24 mutations, random mutations in the community. If a virus shows up that looks like it's a December 2019 virus with no mutations at all, or if it has a mutation in the furin cleavage site that Barrick put in a vaccine sample to attenuate it, you know that person was working in his laboratory, got infected, and showed up at the hospital. So we published that paper. That was the one where we contacted North Carolina officials at the hospital and said, "Hey, we're going to publish this paper. It looks like there are 8 leaks out of Barrick's lab," and he didn't report them. Any comments? And 3 days later, GSAD from Germany calls me up and said, "Hey, the CDC said we want you to take down your paper."
Ooh.
I said, "Wait a second, I didn't talk to the CDC."
Right. So it worked its way back. Now, didn't you just had a big announcement yesterday about the Hudson Institute, right? You just got named something. Can you tell the audience about that? Because that just happened, right?
Yeah. So because of this work and other work, I have just been made a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. It's a think tank. My portfolio is national security and the convergence of artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Because as much as this small engineering that occurred in SARS-CoV-2 that led to a 1% lethal virus, but basically a shutdown of the world and a $25 trillion hit to the world's economy. The ability to use generative AI to help design additional features in the pathogens is quite remarkable. I showed some of the folks in the intelligence community a couple months ago the ability to make a SARS-CoV-2 that's not detectable by PCR, or to make a vector that had the potential to kill. I didn't make this in the laboratory, just in silico. It has the potential to kill everyone in Northern Ireland, but not Scotland, England, or Wales.
Wow.
I picked those countries because my ancestry is Northern Irish, and because their genotypes are so close.
So you can find, so you were able to find something that differentiates Northern Irish people from Scottish and Welsh people, and
English,
and leverage that and use that as like a keyhole to enter and do all kinds of devastating things.
Well, the difference, the in silico analysis and the difference in lethality was 70% in Northern Ireland and 3 to 4% in the other three countries.
Wow.
So, and this is open source now. I mean, I did it with open source here. So, part of my drive now will be to make changes in either the laws or policies or setting up red teams inside the U.S. government to help fight these kinds of potentialities. Because
I'm going to make an
when I was asked
introduction
by the
for you.
state, so I worked for the State Department and Secretary Pompeo from late 2020, early 2021. I was asked during that time frame, is it possible to create a vector of a pathogen or something that targets races? So Chinese, Caucasians, blacks. And I said the differences are so subtle that you really couldn't do that. But that was focusing on the entry of these pathogens into a cell, and the surfaces of cells of people racially are not that different. If you flip it around and say, okay, I'll make a vector that will enter every cell, but it only turn on this lethal gene with certain SNPs inside the DNA of the nucleus, you can end up where we are now with this generative AI. And I'm not sure a human, because there are 3 million SNPs. I basically asked it, how do you differentiate Northern Irish from Scottish, English, and Welsh, the greatest among these 3 million SNPs? That's a combinatorial problem that I don't think the human brain is capable of performing. But, it took the generative AI about 45 minutes to do that analysis, to come out with what SNPs could separate these populations.
Now, would this be a CRISPR-like technique to do something like this inside the cell?
I'm not going to go further into the actual technology, if that's okay.
Yeah. No, of course. So, fascinating topic. Somebody I want to introduce you to via email. So I'll make that introduction. Somebody that will be interested in this that works for the government. It's fascinating, and it sounds like I've got a bunch of material I need to share with you to consider and to review this possibility. I think what happened here is we may have deployed this H7N9 on purpose and then released SARS-CoV-2 on purpose to hide the devastation being caused by H7N9, which obviously would have led back to Wisconsin and Kawaoka and Fauci. And in order to hide that, it was a whole lot better to have something come from Wuhan, get Peter Daszak and Callahan will take care of it, and nobody will know. And we blame China, blame Wuhan, and nobody knows about the H7N9 outbreak. Nobody knows how bad it was. Nobody knows a quarter of the egg-laying chickens on Earth died. And that tells me it was a pretty successful program. I'm the only one throwing monkey wrenches into this thing at the moment, and a couple people I've been working with, but it seems to me this is a pretty dastardly thing that took place, and it's kind of hard to accept. But again, the H7N9, you're not going to pick that up with a PCR test. It's not in BioFire. It's not in ePlex. It's not in Panther. It's not in there. So you're not going to find it.
Well, I mean, so what are called the raw reads, RAW, the raw reads that I used for the 7 patients in the Wuhan Institute of Virology to identify what was going on in the laboratory. Those raw reads are uploaded in many kinds of papers that would look at SARS-CoV-2. So if you were correct, you could take any random SARS-CoV-2 raw read in GeneBank and find complete influenza viruses. If you haven't done that, that would be a prerequisite.
That's a great idea. No, I'll talk
continuing your theory.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. The PCR test won't detect it, but the next generation will. So it's next generation sequencing. Is that what you called it?
So yeah, let's teach a little bit if we can. So,
please.
The PCR test is designed to find a match between whatever probe you put in there and the sample itself.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to test for SARS-CoV-2, you have to identify 2 or 3, typically 3, parts of the genome that aren't going to change very much, and then you make a complementary probe, you put it in there, and you start amplification, and that will be a SARS-specific PCR.
Mm-hmm.
But it will not identify any other genetic material that's in there because it requires the probe to prime the measurement process.
Okay.
So next generation sequencing is the beauty of that is it takes every nucleic acid, every genetic sequence in there, no matter what its source. So again, human, bacteria,
right.
virus, mitochondria, and it amplifies the heck out of them. And then you probe into that for sequences of things you want. So you start putting in a computer the complementary sections of influenza, or anything you want, and it'll tell you how many copies are in there and what the level of identity is.
But is anybody doing this clinically, or this is really something just being done in the research world? It seems like Quest Diagnostics, LabCorp, they're not doing next generation sequencing, are they?
Oh yeah, well, so for typically for sometimes for cancer mutations and that sort of thing, you'll do broad spectrum NGS, and then you'll look for individual mutations in there. It's a hugely time consuming probing exercise because you have to have a hypothesis. I'm going to test whether influenza is in here, and then you have to interrogate the 200 million database.
So it's expensive. It sounds like it's an expensive process.
Yeah, it's both probably time more than money. When I'm looking for things inside, Wuhan specimens, I'll push the button and I'll go make a sandwich because it'll take it 15 or 20 minutes.
But you're in research.
There.
Yeah, but you've got a company. I'm talking about the typical person who's watching the show who thinks they may have been infected with something that wasn't in a PCR test. They don't have this type of testing readily available at their local walk-in health clinic. Like, they can't get next generation sequencing done. It's a special discipline, it seems. Special machinery, special stuff, right? They don't have this at the local LabCorp lab, right? Or they do for cancer.
You're completely correct. No. Any clinical test you'll have to see if you're infected will be PCR based,
right?
And it'll be specific for that, and it'll be kind of a yes/no,
right?
Yes/no. Do you have that? But it doesn't test for the 114 other human pathogens. Viruses.
And it sounds like because it's time consuming, and somebody has to set up this test, somebody has to have a hypothesis of what they're looking for. Somebody's going to spend money. In other words, you're not going to have this test run for $125. This is going to be hundreds or $1,000 or $2,000 to have this test done because it takes so much work to do it, to run it, to set it up, to evaluate it. It's not a set and forget thing like PCR where you put it in the machine, you press the button, come back in 10 minutes and it tells you, what's going on. This is complicated.
Exactly right.
So it's not going to be generally available to the public. One of part of my hypothesis is you're not going to find a virus that's not in the PCR test. So, H11N9 is not in the PCR test. So if I was infected with that and I went to see my physician, he's going to say, no, I can't tell what you have. You don't have this, you don't have this, you don't have this. Mm-hmm. But that virus isn't in there. And exactly. You're not going to have a match.
Well, just like the WIV published a paper showing that by PCR, SARS-CoV-2 was in the samples. And then what Dayu and Mona and I did was to say, well, wait a second, the samples have, 20 other things that are Nipah virus, influenza, right. Vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, we were looking at the same data in a very different way, mm-hmm. very time-consuming way, very difficult way that is not at all done in clinical practice. You're absolutely
right. It was your paper and it was your work documenting that kind of tipped me off to this investigation to determine that H7N9 and the outbreak of it in China was rather extensive. And in fact, the CDC Dr. Tim Uwecki in 2017 said H7N9 is the virus of greatest concern at the CDC. It was the one they were most worried about.
From the Influenza Division at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and I gave an update on the situation regarding avian influenza A H7N9 virus infections of humans that have been occurring since 2013 and are continuing. Not only has there been a huge surge in human cases, almost half the cases reported to date have occurred during late 2016 through 2017, with a peak in February of this year. But there's been a huge geographic expansion since the first epidemic cases were in eastern China, then in southern China, and then there's been westward expansion throughout China. So now in western China, southern China, northern China, eastern China, central China, there have been human cases reported. Now, something that's been significant during this most recent fifth epidemic wave is that there's been significant antigenic drift in these avian influenza A viruses. Now, we know that all influenza A viruses, including those in birds, continue to evolve in unpredictable ways. But we hadn't really seen much antigenic evolution during the first four epidemics. But clearly that's changed. And so vaccines that were developed to protect against the 2013 avian H7N9 viruses, we find that they no longer will protect. And so there's been an effort to develop new vaccine candidates against the viruses circulating in 2017. And CDC has developed a vaccine candidate virus that is going forward to manufacturers and will go into clinical trials in 2018. That's very important for pandemic preparedness. The other thing that's, other development that's occurred during this fifth epidemic wave is that the virus has changed from a low pathogenic avian influenza A virus that causes no disease in infected chickens. And in fact, this has been really difficult issue because the chickens look very healthy, but they're infected. They can transmit to other chickens, and then they can transmit to people and actually kill them. So how do people get infected? Well, the main risk factor back in 2013 in the first few epidemic waves was visiting a live poultry market, particularly in urban areas. And now what's happened is this virus has shifted now to rural areas and westward in China. So we're seeing some cases that are attributed to exposure to backyard poultry. So it's visiting a live poultry market, it's raising backyard poultry, it's direct contact or very close contact, and it's probably aerosolization of virus into the respiratory tract. And this virus has the ability to get into the upper as well as the lower respiratory tract of humans. The other few things to mention is that now this virus has evolved into a highly pathogenic H7N9 virus form, and what that ends up doing is causes disease in infected chickens and actually high mortality. So we have two kinds of this virus circulating in China. We have the low pathogenic H7N9 virus and the highly pathogenic H7N9 virus, and both have transmitted to humans and cause high mortality. The good news is that there's been no evidence of sustained human-to-human transmission of H7N9 virus. So most of these human cases reflect sporadic poultry-to-human transmission, but there have been some instances of probable limited human-to-human transmission of this virus, and it's occurred in households among blood-related family members, but it's also occurred in healthcare settings. And most of these situations have occurred during prolonged, unprotected, close exposure to a symptomatic patient. So unfortunately, in healthcare settings, there has been patient-to-patient transmission of H7N9 virus, as well as patient-to-healthcare worker transmission of H7N9 virus. And this highlights the importance in healthcare settings of rigidly adhering to recommended infection prevention and control measures, and that includes placing the patient, if possible, in an airborne isolation room. And if that's not possible, you want to move that patient to a setting, to a facility that has an airborne isolation room. In addition, you want to follow airborne precautions as well as standard and contact precautions. So that means gown, gloves, eye protection, as well as N95 respirator or higher level of respiratory protection. You really want to limit the number of healthcare workers and family members in the room. So this really remains a cause for concern. We do expect a sixth epidemic wave of human infections to begin later this year in mainland China. And unfortunately, we do expect more cases. We don't know what's going to happen. This virus spreads into poultry in Southeast Asia, neighboring countries to China, and there could be associated human cases. So we really need to keep an eye on this virus. At CDC, it's the #1 virus of the greatest concern because of the potential for impact in humans to cause a pandemic, as well as the severity of the disease. So thanks very much.
So when I line all that stuff up, this appears like a pretty dark story. I've got a bunch of research material I need to share with you. I want you to look at this next strain tree showing the H7N9 development in China, and all of a sudden it kind of takes a turn that I think when you look at this, I think you might be taken aback. I think I'm going to get an email back from you and you're going to go, you might be onto something here. This is weird. So with that,
finding frozen genomes in a phylogenetic tree, as that's called, is the sine qua non of a laboratory derived virus.
No doubt,
because it's just frozen in time, and it's coming back in time. I mean, there's
nothing you've published that I disagree with. I think everything you documented is on the money, and it provided stepping stones for me to go to a pretty dark place, admittedly. But I think when you see the evidence, again, Bob Malone saw the evidence and was like, man, this is tough to argue against, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
You know, and I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
Let me share it with you. Let me share it with you. I can't thank you enough. You're a hero of mine. You changed the game. You've saved so many lives in your career. I can't thank you enough.
Thanks, John. It's been great to talk to you today, and I hope your listeners have enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, I'm sure they have, and I'll look forward to hearing back from you, because I got some materials I think you're gonna be pretty interested in. I'm gonna document this 40% case fatality rate, and I want to hear what you have to say about this next strain tree. I think it's pretty.
And my book on the origin of the
please tell everybody about that.
The code is Witness. From Encounter Books will be out on January 13th, the 6th year anniversary of the announcing the outbreak, basically, and having the sequence available. So it looks at whether it came from nature or a lab, and it clearly came from a lab. It looks at whether it was a wild virus, a natural virus from a lab, or clearly engineered. And then I go into the hypothesis, was all the engineering academic, or does it actually look like there might be some nefarious aspects with some of the asymptomatic transmission capabilities and immune suppression capabilities of the ORF8 gene? So
very good. Well, I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to look at that, because again, this is, to me, it was the watershed moment, was your documentation of that, and your documentation with Mona and Dayu of the H7N9, even if it's just vaccine material found in these patients. That's all we needed. That's all we need it to be. We don't need it to be anything more than that. It means that people were getting vaccinated for H7N9 in China. Why? Right? And we get to
I think we make that point, or we don't, or I should make the point now, is you're absolutely right, but there was no evidence of a clinical trial for this particular vaccine going on. So there could be, secret aspects going on.
I'll send you the paperwork on the vaccine. We know they did this H5N1 H7N9 combined vaccine. I'll send you the paperwork on that so you get to see that. And I'm sure Dayu knows about that. Again, you're a hero. I can't thank you enough for what you've done and for taking the time to speak with the audience. You're a gentleman. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thanks, John. It's great talking.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks a million.